Corporate liability.
Yeah. Yeah. And
who's going to get blamed when stuff goes wrong now?
Yeah.
I don't mean that in the context of IBM, but in terms of our clients.
Yeah,
brilliant. That is definitely a big one. That is going to start pretty soon, isn't it?
Yeah.
You can smell the lawyers.
Yeah, smell it, exactly. Smell it already. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's difficult to know where that monkey's going to stop, isn't it? Really, the government seems to be pouring more fuel on the fire every day.
Yeah,
good. All right. Well, let's go. Start. Okay, Mike, are you good to go?
Yeah, good.
Yeah, cool. Let's start.
Well, welcome everybody. I'm Mike Stewart. I work with Tom and David. As you probably all are well aware, Tom is a vastly experienced turnaround leader. And along the way, he has distilled his experience and learnings into the Winning Thinking program. David is a former Marine, a Royal Marine. He is a senior psychotherapist who consults to major companies and is an expert in managing fear in very adverse situations. Our subject today we've got is retail survival in the new normal. And I'm going to hand over to Tom, who will introduce us all now to the attendees.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So this discussion is all about retail survival and sharing the pragmatic tips of how to do that. So we've got a fantastic list of guests from quite a diverse background. What we're trying to do is share diverse opinions to try and make sense of the new normal. So Julian Burnett from IBM is going to kick us off, and Julian's got a pretty esteemed background in hands-on retail at exec level. Quite a few of the retailers, I think, Julian, after you just left, went bust, but anyway, that's probably by the by. Then moving on to Tyrone. Yeah, there's still one left, yeah. Then moving on to Tyrone. Tyrone is a former president of the UK TMA, plus also managing director of Duff and Phelps. Huge experience of company turnaround. He's also got the extraordinary distinction of being somebody who's actually done the original Winning Thinking program. Andy Pardo is an expert in artificial intelligence and technology, and Andy will give his perspective, which is intentionally pretty much the opposite to mine, which is what I enjoy. But I'm very interested, Andy, genuinely to hear what your thoughts are in terms of retail survival is.
Sure.
And David Allen is a US tech veteran, and so it was probably the best way maybe to describe you, David, with a sense of humour, but also has got a foot in both sides of the pond. So he's been in the UK for 35 years, but also been very active in the US. Very interesting background. So David will finish things off, and then David McLean will comment and collect some questions from the audience and comment on the people issues. Then Mike at the end will wrap it up. So without further ado, over to you, Julian.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you for the invitation to join this illustrious group. Look, I'll try and summarise my perspective. I think the retail industry right now is approaching the end of the first phase of this situation. I would try to characterise it coming in three phases. We're in survival mode in retail now, but coming to the end of that. Many organisations starting to think about revival. What that next phase looks like and feels like depends on which side of the industry you're in. If you're in food retail, it's a very positive thing. If you're in fashion retail, it's much more challenging, and everywhere in between, different categories of retail are experiencing this differently. The third phase, of course, is returning to some level of thriving. We see survival being perhaps 10 weeks, revival perhaps 10 months, and let's hope those that go on to thrive for the next 10 years. But I'd say three things that come to mind immediately when I look at that transition from survival into revival is There's been a huge increase in localism, something driven by consumers' inability to shop outside of their geographic domain. And that localism, I think, will continue to be a trend through the revival and potentially into the thriving phase. So I like to sort of characterize it by closing the gap between production and consumption. There's an awful lot of cost involved in bringing stuff from long distance into the UK. Why not just get it from the UK? And so UK manufacturing industry, consumer products industries could play a big part in reviving retail if they put themselves in a position where they could be a local sourcing partner. So two win-win for the UK there. So try and reduce the geographic and the temporal gap between product and people consuming product. The second, and it's definitely a trend that had already begun, was deranging and reducing choice. We don't need 10 different varieties of pesto or pasta or tomato soup. Perhaps 5 will do. And, carrying vast ranges, particularly in grocery retail, we've seen the trend already with Dave Lewis announcing a reduction at Tesco. I think that if you're in survival mode and moving to revival of your business, buying less stuff and reducing choice for customers obviously protects working capital, but it does also play into a reduction in potential shrinkage and wastage in fast-moving lines and perishable lines as well. So offering less choice is a good strategy. And then the third for me is this notion that we're all as retailers carrying, for vast majority of time in fashion retail, underutilized assets in our distribution and logistics capability because of the peakiness of the business. Actually, the handling of product through distribution logistics networks tantamount to equivalent across different categories. I'm calling for much greater collaboration now in the industry. If you've got a distribution centre that's sat idle until peak trading at Christmas, offer that capacity to somebody else that needs it during other parts of the year. If you've got a transport network that's driving around lots of lorries and vans half full of fresh air because you haven't got sufficient demand right now, offer it to somebody that has. Can you collaborate and partner to exploit the assets that you've invested in more effectively? They would be my 3 big ones. As I say, we're moving into this next stage of revival. I think it's going to be characterized by an acute emphasis on keeping going and keeping safe. And the keeping safe, as we start to ramp back up in terms of production volume in manufacturing, distribution volume, and retail volume, is going to look like a very, very significant requirement for compliance and ultimately legislative compliance around health and safety. And so keeping going whilst keeping workers safe, I suspect, will become a new fixation for many of the senior leaders in the retail industry as they start to move into this next phase. That was it for me, Tom.
Yeah, thank you very much, Julian. That's very clear. And in terms of the main, if there was one thing from a profitability perspective, if you were back in retail, in the driving seat, what would the one thing? I
think it comes down to that living well with less. Reducing your range and limiting your working capital exposure to product that is unlikely to sell at the rate and sell through rates that you're asking for. I think choice is an interesting one. Consumers are prepared to wait longer now, and consumers are prepared to have a reduction of choice. Don't waste capital on things that are not going to sell. It's a no-brainer, but...
Yeah, no, I think fantastic, really clear. Thank you very much, Julian. Bang on the money. Andy, you've now got 30 seconds to do your bit, so to catch up. No, I'm joking. So over to you.
It's all good. So I think there's a few things from my perspective. So first of all, looking at the sort of lessons learned from previous recessions and crisis. So I worked in the banking industry for quite some time, and just thinking about what happened in the financial services during the 2008 crisis. So obviously with Lehman's disappearing, some of the other banks got huge additional volumes in transactions, and they had some interesting challenges to cope with that, and obviously needed to invest even more than they already did in technology to sort of cope with that sort of unforeseen spike in sort of volumes of trades and transactions. And I think really that's, it's easy to say in hindsight, but I think that's a lesson to us all, that across all industries, in fact, that often we build sort of technology and systems to cope with normal volumes, but we don't necessarily stress test them enough to cope with the abnormal volumes and capabilities. So I think there's some interesting lessons to be learned there to ensure that for, you know, the spike that we've seen in online shopping that sort of resulted from the sort of lockdown, and you know, making sure that systems can cope with that massive sort of increase in volume, I think is hopefully a lesson learned that companies will sort of take forward. Obviously the sort of flexible workforce and you know how that can sort of come into play as well with these changing conditions. But I think I was actually spoke at a Retail Week conference a few years ago, and there was then, as I'm sure continues to be, an appetite in leveraging technology, and especially the data and the analytics that a lot of these companies have, that sort of an untapped sort of knowledge and insight in their data to sort of better predict trends and sort of buying behaviors, etc. And I think not just that from a local company perspective, but maybe how could we have better leveraged that from an industry, but also a country perspective, and how could, you know, the UK learn what was going on in some of the countries that were slightly ahead of the crisis than us, and how could we have sort of leveraged that knowledge better to react better. And I think that's also an interesting sort of insight to that. I think moving forward as well, I think, to me, it feels like we are not going to return back to the normal that we sort of know and love previously. Things are going to change, and I think that's going to affect everyone. So I think companies will maybe deprioritize sort of central offices, and how is that going to affect town centres and therefore the buying habits of people. So having sort of retail sort of sandwich shops in city centres, are they really going to get the volume that they used to get in the future? Because, you know, many companies have been forced to leverage technologies like we're using right now for sort of meetings, and that's becoming the new normal. And I think that's going to have a widespread effect on the entire environment, and I think retail will see the knock-on effects of that, and how do they cope with that and adapt their business model, because I think it's going to have a widespread effect. And I think there's obviously things that can be done, and Julian talked about the more sort of local sort of view of things, and I think that's, you know, taking that even further to sort of centering things near to where people live rather than where they work, and I think that's going to be very interesting. And I think, you know, obviously I'm an advocate of technology and AI and automation. I think there's a huge amount that can be done to make processes and operations more efficient, more robust. And I think where it's been a struggle maybe for some industries, and retail in particular, to sort of leverage the latest and greatest technologies. Of course, every industry has the leaders and the followers in those kind of things, but I think it's really important to sort of look forward and say, okay, how can we use technology to help deal with these kind of situations going forward? So, you know, it's not just about recovery. Obviously, that's important over the next few years, but it's how do we cope with a similar situation in 5 or 10 years' time, because there is a frequency to recessions, there is a frequency to pandemics. How do we make sure we're set for coping with these things going forward, and how can we empower technology to help with that? So I think it's really important that we sort of learn from history and look how we can move forward. But I think in my opinion, we're not going to return to the same normal as we've seen. I think it's going to be a very different environment, and I think that's going to require retailers and all industries to really adapt to that and see what the new normal is going to be. So I think that's a really interesting challenge for us all in the next sort of 12 to 18 months.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah. So if there's one single thing that you would, if you were got some budget to spend on technology and you're running a retailer, what would that be?
For me, it's about data analytics and customer behavior, because I think that can give real early indicators and early insight as to how shopping behaviors are changing, and therefore giving the businesses a bit more time to deal with that and react to that. So I think that is fundamental in every business, but especially with retail, and especially in these dynamic environments where customer behavior can change. But I think there'll always be those early indicators that if you can spot those, you can start to see new trends coming. Yeah.
I started off by saying I disagree with some of your views, but actually I completely agree with that. It's absolutely my experience. So thank you, Andy. That's by chance. I'm not looking for, I'm not necessarily looking for agreement. I think it's a very interesting, diverse view. Thank you for that. So I'm going to just contribute something around making money in retail and profit. I think the first thing I'd say is I remember 25 years or even 30 years ago when I bought a bike. I'm quite a keen cyclist. It cost me 1,200 quid, and a bike still costs 1,200 quid. The challenge is, where does that value add now? And China have been massively fueling, keeping inflation down by providing cheap goods. But and I think the other thing I'd add is also that we need to face reality. So in the UK, there are 500,000 businesses under threat, so there's a hit to demand, and I'll come on to that, some of the impact. And the other challenge, which I think you touched on, Tyrone, is the ability for businesses with a weak balance sheet to restart. That's very difficult, and most businesses go bust when they come out. And you also touched on, Tyrone, the issues around commercial property and valuation, and the landlords really have got nowhere else to go, and a lot of them are very highly over leveraged. So I think that's the backdrop I'd add. In terms of making money, I think there are four types of retailers I'd like to point out. One is what I describe as being a digital intermediator, which is a FANG company or Airbnb. And what these companies are primarily focused on is control of attention. And what they do is they put a lot of pressure on the supply chain because they control the demand. They're very low cost. They create a dependence, a digital dependence, and create, for example, in the case of Amazon, 600,000 jobs at pretty much at minimum wage. And with that, there's a big, impact on society. So, and this is one of the reasons why Toys R Us got into trouble, because they were highly dependent on Amazon for their digital product. Google too have linked up with China in the US, which is, I think, China is a far bigger threat to Amazon than we estimate. And I think this whole assumption around the thinking convenience and attention is actually much oversold. You talked about this, Julian, about people being willing to wait a bit longer, but it very much leads to commoditizing products and loss of brand in the sort of mix through the intermediator sale. Or the intermediated sale. So the second one is around China. Chinese businesses are similar. They're about surveillance and control of population. But you can see the similarity with the US companies. The difficult thing with these businesses is they intentionally make no profit, and they're impossible to compete with because they have such vast scale. And the anti-competitive legislation was always founded on dominant players charging too much money. This is a whole new dynamic of dominant players charging too little money, which is far more aggressive. As well, Alibaba is a Hong Kong listed company. The other thing as well, that not many people probably know, is that the Thomas Cook digital assets, which is another former retailer, were bought by a Chinese company and they're looking for routes to market, and only cost 10 million quid. I actually looked at picking those up with a VC because that's a huge opportunity, and they're after scale. The third category is tech online businesses where their funding has been pulled, right? Which is Ocado. Ocado funding hasn't been pulled, but I think they're under threat of, or challenged in terms of funding moving forwards. Where they've got vast, the profitability when you add back in the depreciation actually doesn't look strong. Food retailer, supplier, largely, and ASOS as well. They've had the interesting thing about ASOS is they've taken a 25% hit to revenue, which is actually in their top end, which is where the margin is. And my estimate, Fag Packet, is they need to put their prices up 30% to actually get their gross margin back to recover that. The interesting thing about ASOS as well is their operating costs are very high because, as you say, Julian, it's like moving the changing room to the distributor. It goes back 2 or 3 times, and there's a large cost to that which people underestimate. There's another one which is a bit sadder, which is John Lewis, which is that their ownership model. They need 500,000. They're not unlikely to open all of their stores. They need 500 million. Sorry. They've got a challenge with their ownership model. How they're going to raise that with their current owner structure. And the last one, the fourth one, is direct retailers, which includes which actually got their own brand, but also mixed bricks and mortar. The issue I think there is this sales per square foot is always the metric that drives retailers, and there's just been too much expansion. There's far too much foot and not enough sales. And you can see that out of town shopping centres and the like. And I think that the key to that in terms of those businesses is around relationship. It's around the loyalty you develop with customers, which is around developing a relationship, people-to-people relationship. It's about understanding the different products, the bread and butter, the customer recruiting products, and the McLaren, which is where you make your money. And I completely agree, Julian, in terms of rationalising the range. A lot of our turnaround work we've done with retailers is rationalising those products that really don't fit into either one of those categories. There are some really good ones. For example, Primark's a great retailer, which is bricks and mortar, no online presence at all. Real challenge with social distancing, which David Allen will no doubt talk to us about a bit later. And garden centres is another one, which are good market, the baby boomers, but they've got the benefit of easier social distancing. And social distancing is largely unlikely to go away. And you've got food, I think, which is relatively untouched. There's lots of alcohol consumption going on at the moment, which is absolutely excellent. So I think, so in a nutshell, just wrapping up, I think overall the pricing needs to go up. I spend most of my time in turnaround putting pricing up. A lot of people in these situations haven't got the confidence to do that. The focus around loyalty, around people-to-people relationships and all the personality of these businesses is critical. Sustainability as well. I think the one way to improve sustainability is to put the prices up to reduce consumption. It's also about creating good jobs as well, because in this mix, if we have a whole raft of people who are on the minimum wage, they haven't got money to spend anyway. And there's the ethics and the digital addiction side of this. So the challenge with this is really I think it's largely around creating teams that actually get to grips with this and address this, and overcome the fear to reach, actually flag up some of these issues and break some of these norms. So a lot of businesses are caught in the concern of putting up prices and losing customers, or they might be saying tech is the future, which of course these mantras are both deadly, and you can see that far from utopias. So I think whilst that's the big picture, there's lots of local actions at local level that can be taken themselves. But I think there's one main takeaway. It's around relationships, it's around people-to-people relationships, and it's also around, even in digital businesses, personality. Actually people being themselves, and that coming through in the marketing, so people actually feel a positive association with these organisations. Because a lot of these digital models create a huge fear of being yourself. So that'd be my contribution. So David McLean, any comments or questions that we've got? We've got limited time. I think we've
Absolutely. Well, we have 4 questions. I mean, I can be brief as well. I need to say, but we have 4 questions, and I'll take them in order. From Richard, I am interested in the potential impact of FMCG startups of some of the trends discussed, particularly trends towards stocking fewer brands. Recently, it seems that there has been a new startup brand on the shelf every week, gone again within a month. Will major retailer interest in new brands reduce going forward?
If I might just quickly answer that, I think it's a matter of scale, David. I think the simple answer is if we believe that localism will continue as a trend, then startups in that category are likely to be favoured by the supermarkets if they can supply. But I don't think there's an immediate future for big scale startups in the FMCG category. I think the investment required to get to large national scale distribution capacity is too great right now, and I don't think there will be huge inflows of capital towards that kind of category. However, if you are able to supply in a 25 to 50 mile radius of your production facility, and you can engage consumers in that geography with your own brand marketing, perhaps the supermarkets will list you, because they are starting to look at local listings for categories where consumer demand is obvious. But I don't think investment at scale in FMCG startups would be advisable right now, personally.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Let's have one more. Yeah. Thanks, Jim.
Just one more question, yeah?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay. Well, that one's been answered by Calvin on the panel, so I'll just take another one here. From Andrew Pepper. The big issue with retail will be when the excuse, in inverted commas, of the virus stops and creditors will demand payment. Yet the sales will be slow to build. This gives a very negative WC forecast when businesses restart. Panel view, please.
Yeah, I made that point earlier. I think the danger, in any downturn, the danger is actually cranking back up again. So 100%. I mean, you're a turnaround expert, Andrew. Tyrone made the same point. So 100%. The challenge here is actually coming out of this dip. That's when organisations run out of cash. Any observations, David McLean, from your side in terms of people's side, in terms of just a couple of short points, please?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm interested in people. That's also what I'm all about, and helping people through winning thinking process, of course. And I really the point that you made at the beginning there, Julian, about the survival, revival, or survive, revive, and thrive. And what phase we're at the moment, well, I suppose specifically survive still, and how we move into the revive. So those of you that remember A-level psychology, or anyone that's studied psychology, might remember something called the Kubler-Ross grief cycle. And that, quite negatively actually, but it's to do with terminally ill patients, people going through death or who have dealt with that. But actually, when we look at that cycle, we can see the same thing happening in society, going through the inverted commas grief that people have had to deal with. And from a personal point of view, or from a person point of view, and it's a kind of a scaling as things move forward, and as we start to move through where we are at the moment into hopefully brighter areas. One of the key areas within that is emotional support. And we're kind of coming to that part at the moment. It's people that run businesses, and we all kind of understand that, but we need to recognise that it's the emotional support that's necessary now to recognise and help and support the individuals in moving forward. And from the emotional support, the next kind of stage is into the guidance and direction. That comes from leadership. It comes from people that know what they're talking about, but we need to recognise that from a people point of view, and recognise just how important that is, the mental health and mental well-being in terms of success. We must have all angles, but we must have that as well. So I just want to make those quick points. So thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. That's well made, David. So, Mr. Allen, cheer us all up. There's a bit of doom and gloom there, so see if you can shine some light on this situation.
No, I mean, I think we had some really great comments here. I too, Julian, am a real fan of the things you're saying. It's quite interesting when you see what happens from a sort of 25,000 foot perspective. So people's workflow has completely changed, and not voluntarily. So they didn't voluntarily say, "I think we'll all stay at home and we'll do this, we'll do that," or "We'll all learn how to use Zoom," or "We're all going to try to do this." It's just changed. So therefore people are working differently, dressing differently. I wouldn't want to be in the fashion business right now because I've seen it locally, dozens and dozens of people are completely focused on how can I get rid of my crap. I have so much crap that I've accumulated because we have for 50 years run this gigantic consumption-based economy. And everything advertising-wise, marketing-wise has been to fuel consumption. And people are now sitting going, what do I need all this stuff for? Why do I need to open my pan drawer and see 42 different pans in there? I could use 3. I'm struggling with how to figure out how to use all these. There's a couple things I think are really important. One is the change of what has happened right now. What that's going to do to us in terms of the new normal. So the first one is the issue of workflow. It's just been imposed on you. You have to do things differently. The second thing is engagement. And a couple of you have sort of danced around this topic a little bit, but the issue of engagement is going to be fueled by a couple of things that I think that are really important. One is the analytics. And the other is artificial intelligence, which is tucking straight into the analytics. So I think that those two really go hand in hand because we need to be able to figure out what people need before they need it. Quite a famous American who made cars named Henry Ford said, they asked him, why don't you ask your customers what you want? And Henry Ford said, if I ask my customers what they want, they'd say faster horses. Steve Jobs said something similar about the start of the iPhone. Why would I ask them? They don't even know what they want. And so we're going into a period where the real opportunity is for people to supply things that the public needs and don't even know that they want yet. So those are a couple of my thoughts.
Fantastic. That's great, David. So in terms of, I think that's very similar to what Andy and I were talking about, that live customer information. My observation, that changes incredibly frequently. Even during the period of 6 months when we turn retail around, that changes on a sort of month by month, week by week basis, and it shifts quite dramatically, and you need to shift to that. And I think that's absolutely bang on the money. Thank you. Tyrone, I don't know if is your microphone working now?
Yeah, try me now.
Yeah, that's better. So can you just give us in a minute or so? We're a bit pushed for time. Your contribution, the main headings from a restructuring turnaround perspective, if you could please have another go.
Yeah, clearly, whilst we're in this survival mode, then you'd have to say that from a turnaround perspective, controlling of costs and controlling of cash is absolutely critical. So in terms of costs, only incurring those costs that are absolutely critical for the business's survival. Having said that, I would not be I wouldn't be kicking out the marketing spend necessarily, because clearly if you're going to revive yourself, you need to be there, and you need to be at the forefront of people's minds when the sort of gates are opened again, in order to make the most of that opportunity. But clearly, as part of getting there, cash liquidity is absolutely king, isn't it? And so I'd be looking at trying to retain as much cash as I could in the business, simply because that gives you the firepower to apply your resources in whatever direction you choose to take. I think in the context of retail, and in the context of businesses more generally, I think management would be misplaced to think that things are going to go back to normal anytime soon. much along the lines that we've been talking about this lunchtime. And for me, I think the biggest vulnerability is going to come for business when, the government support stops, the costs come back online, and business owners have a misplaced expectation that revenues are going to be 100% of where they were in January. And I think that's where there's a judgment needed, isn't there, in terms of saying, okay, what does my business going to look like in this post-COVID-19 environment? What if my revenues are only half or 2/3 of what they were before? And I think one thing it's certainly going to do is going to sort out the wheat from the chaff in the terms of, anybody that's got a weak balance sheet, not a lot of meat, not a lot of skin in the game, is going to have to think very seriously about, do we spend the next 3, 4, 5 years trying to make good the losses that we incurred over the COVID-19 period, or do we actually just start with a clean sheet of paper and try and phoenix something out of the ashes?
Yeah, 100%. Thank you very much. That's bang on the money. So there we are. Thank you very much for your contributions. Mike, you've got the unenviable job of trying to pull out the main points, if that's okay. So over to you, sir.
Yeah, it's been a very, very interesting session, really, absolutely fascinating. With Julian kicking off at the beginning there with the issue of localism and deranging, which is probably quite closely related. And I think that actually presents a lot of opportunity as well in the United Kingdom, which has a very well-established SME sector and could be quite an interesting growth area there. Underutilized assets and the rationalization of logistics and supply chains, collaboration there. Yeah, I guess that is a major opportunity, really is. And the associated effects of on real estate, I think it was Tyrone and Andy were talking about how property values are likely to be affected because the new normals would probably include an awful lot more working away from the office than it does now. So why do we need all these square meters of expensive office space? Could well be a major issue and opportunity. Quite interestingly, Andy commented on the online shopping situation and how that has been unable to cope during this period, which would have been a massive opportunity for retailers, and the main guys haven't been able to capitalize on that. And therefore, the importance of data analytics going forward, yeah, I can see that. And the comment that David Allen made about Henry Ford saying, customers would ask for faster horses. This is a typical problem that we'll be faced with now. And then, of course, the traditional problem of turnarounds where it's actually not the downturn that kills the business. It's trying to get out of the downturn and grow your business again. And that's when all the chickens come home to roost and you run out of cash. So, talking to IPs in the last week or so, they are not so busy right now, but they do anticipate this work to pick up solidly in the revival time that Julian highlighted. So Tom, that's a very brief, and I've skated over a lot of very important issues there, but it's been a tremendously enjoyable and very, very interesting, and I thank everybody.
100%. Yeah, thanks, guys. Thank you very much for your contributions. It's been a very interesting, diverse perspective, and I think we've got I think we've got a far better, clearer idea of what's happening in retail and what the options might be. So thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. Cheers.